Welcome to Elk begins with a somewhat enigmatic cutscene, a simplistic and almost childlike animation of a man walking among trees. The white outlines and dark backdrop form a stark contrast to the colourful art that will characterise the rest of the game. The narrator tells us that he once asked if it was true that Anders had died 3 times. He then tells us that Anders was born and raised on Pine Road and that he walked to Elk every day. This first statement frames Anders as part of a shared local folklore or myth. He is an enigma, something to be perhaps marvelled at or feared. The second is apparently biographical, presenting solid facts about Anders as a person. On one hand, there's the story of the man who has died 3 times, and on the other, there's the story of the man walking every day. Welcome to Elk begins with Frigg's arrival on the island of Elk, and I was immediately charmed by the brightly coloured cartoony animations that characterise the game. They're fluid and highly expressive, with character movements that are often exaggerated and comedic, but at the same time, their faces often convey varying levels of emotional complexity. At first the mood is light-hearted and optimistic, as Frigg is herself when disembarking upon the island to begin her new life as Jan's apprentice. But it doesn't take long to see that beneath Frigg's optimism, there's a hint of uncertainty. Her discovery of the painted-on life ring that wouldn't actually save her if she were drowning hints that she's anxious about surviving in this strange new place. As you follow Jan deeper into Elk, you're able to run around a bit and interact with coloured objects on the island, including this weird squid with a knife that, to be honest, reminded me of the mascot for the Osaka seafood concern. I don't blame Frigg for deciding that it's perhaps best to leave this knife-wielding cephalopod alone. Once you've run around a bit, you'll find you can't actually do much aside from advance the story, and so we enter the Hermit and begin Frigg's welcome party. This scene does a great job at laying out the social relationships, characters, and tensions that are present within the Elk community. We're able to quickly grasp who's who and what's what, or at the very least, the foundations for learning more about Elk and its community. It's clear, for example, that there is lingering resentment over the role and influence that Mr. Bo's wealthy father had on the island. And once introductions are over, you get to take part in Welcome to Elk's first mini-game, a Simon Says style drinking game. Honestly, I did a terrible job mimicking Sue, but she is a tricky adversary here. She's certainly managed to fool me more than once. Damn you, Sue! But I mean, look at her face. Isn't everything about Sue's cheeky, I don't give a shit what you think, / and I'm also kind of out of it personality just literally written on her face? And this is where the art style really excels, expressing character emotions and personalities in a unique and fun style that never feels overbearing or simplistic. And it's through minigames such as Simon Says that important moments of Welcome to Elk's gameplay start to appear, offering the player something to do other than simply walking from A to B. Otherwise, the gameplay is pretty linear. If the game wants you to go to place B and talk to Mr. X, for example, then there's pretty much nowhere else you can go and no one else you can talk to. But the minigames are important, not only because they add gameplay variety, but because they always relate directly to a character or event within the game's narrative. In a dialogue-heavy game like Elk, it's one of the ways the game really gets you more involved in what's going on by making you actively participate. For example, when visiting the mansion of Mr. Bow, you discover more about his troubled relationship with his father through a minigame created by Mr. Bow. At first, you are shown a colourful slideshow telling you about Mr. Bow's childhood neglect at the hands of his father, clearly something of a paranoid megalomaniac who felt it necessary to lock his son away because he feared he would eventually replace him. But nowhere is Mr. Bow's troubled relationship with his father, or his own personality, more poignantly or hilariously expressed than through Mr. Bow's increasingly bizarre golf minigame that sees you using golf balls, putters, and bowling balls to destroy his father's highly volatile vintage beers. It's a game a child would have invented, one who doesn't care about rules and just wants to really have fun and blow off steam, while also destroying some of his father's legacy each time he plays. And Mr. Bow is very childlike in many ways, spending his adult life trying to reclaim the carefree childhood his father denied him. Bow has no interest in his father's legacy and has actively rejected it by closing his father's brewery and halting his projects to modernise Elk. He also allows his father's ostentatious estate to fall into disrepair, not to mention the devil horns he has drawn on his father's portrait. The shift from the tragic backstory of Mr. Bow's childhood to his ridiculous minigame is a great example of how the game's mood is always balanced on a knife's edge. The tension between comedy and tragedy in the game is also established early on through the introduction of the game's principal antagonist. Leroy's introduction is perhaps the first sign that not all is as sunny as it seems on Elk. When Leroy crashes Frigg's welcome party, the tension becomes so thick you could cut it with a knife. A change in atmosphere which is reflected with bone-chilling precision in the game's music. Leroy is aggressive, argumentative, and it is clear that the islanders hate and fear him. But their loyalty to their small island family, and its newest member, is clear when he approaches an intoxicated Frigg and begins to suggest that they go somewhere alone to get to know each other. The other islanders immediately attempt to defuse the situation through diplomacy, but it is ultimately Sue, the local problematic but lovable alcoholic we met earlier, who manages to fend off Leroy's unwanted attentions by smashing a bottle over her own head. This unexpected and absurd act succeeds in taking the breeze out of Leroy's sails. Shocked by Sue's act and the sudden rallying of the locals behind her, Leroy takes his leave and the party resumes with a sense of victory and camaraderie. Only, Leroy is clearly still a threat. I don't know about anyone else, but for me the threat of Leroy appearing from the darkness was in my head any time I had to walk Frigg home alone in the dark, which happens frequently throughout the game. Anyone who has felt like someone is following them at night will appreciate how oppressive and frightening this feeling can be. I was constantly on edge, waiting for something bad to happen. So for me, while Frigg's drunken, vomit-filled odyssey home was quite funny, it was also tinged with the apprehension of Leroy's reappearance. And this is the first instance of where Welcome to Elk begins to show its mastery of atmosphere, because you find yourself constantly caught between enjoying the game's humour and mini-games and worrying about what on earth could happen next as the game's narrative gains momentum. Serious moments are often interrupted by ridiculous moments, such as Sue bashing her own head with a beer bottle, all mundane concerns, and these are all arguably examples of the game's use of bathos. These sudden changes in mood create the game's taut atmosphere where comedy and tragedy are continuously jostling for primacy, constantly destabilizing and disrupting one another, leaving us feeling uncertain as to what might happen next. The cartoony art style and atmospheric soundtrack support these sudden transitions of mood seamlessly, with a shift of instrumentals, tempo, or even a slight change in a character's expression. And this is where we enter big spoiler country, because I'm going to talk about a specific story within Welcome to Elk, and how it's just a fantastic example of the game's unique and interesting style of storytelling. If you'd rather avoid spoilers, please skip ahead to the time shown on the screen. Frigg isn't on the island for long before tragedy strikes. It is clear that life on Elk isn't easy. The island's economy is non-existent after the death of Mr. Bo's father, and Elk lacks modern amenities like internet, proper hospital facilities, or modern transport links to the mainland. Not only that, but the weather can change from warm to freezing overnight. Frigg is at first enchanted by the snow, but the villagers are quick to impress upon her how dangerous the weather can be. And nowhere is this impressed upon us more than through the death of Jeppe, the boatman who brought Frigg to the island. The alarm is raised when Beth bursts into the hermit one morning and announces that after a night of drinking at the bar, Jeppe never came home. Considering the sudden change in weather and the amount that Jeppe had been drinking that night, the islanders are immediately worried for his welfare, and a search party is quickly formed to find him. And unfortunately, we do. This is where the game really begins to show how powerful its style can be. The horrified faces of the islanders and Jeppe. The game has already ensured that we know how important Jeppe is to the islanders. He's not only their friend, but also their link to the mainland, and Beth's only means of financial support for herself and her young daughter. What's more, Jeppe's death is so sudden and pointless, the result of a drunken lapse in judgment that saw him, for whatever reason, decide to get behind the wheel of a tractor, only to crash it and freeze to death in the snow. And to render the situation even more desperate, due to Elm's lack of any real police presence or even a hospital, it's up to Frigg and Jan to move the body. What comes next is truly heartbreaking. It's a minigame. A minigame where we have to close Jeppe's frozen eyes and carry his body to a sled. I don't think there have been many moments in my video game playing career that have felt more poignant and tragic. It takes so long to get his body to the sled. Time just stretches out as Frigg and the player come to terms with the reality of Jeppe's death through this tangible interaction with his body, looking down into his frozen face. I was surprised. I'd begun to feel that this game was going to have a lot more depth than I may have originally anticipated, but this? Not only was Jeppe's death shocking and sad, but then the minigame was so uncomfortable and really made me think about the reality of this kind of situation for Frigg, or anyone really, of having such intimate contact with death. But I still wasn't prepared for what came next. Because shortly after experiencing Jeppe's tragic death, we meet a mysterious man in Frigg's house. And then the game plays an interview-style video recording of a man telling the true story that Jeppe's death is based on. The real story of a real man who, after drunk driving and accidentally going down a toboggan run, froze to death in the snow. His retelling of the discovery of the body by himself and a friend is filled with visceral detail. It's heart-rending, because it's real. It's a true story of how a real person died. The telling of the fictional Jeppes' death, with whom we already had sympathy, also creates sympathy for this real, unknown person, because he was also someone who had a life, who had people who relied on him, who had people who loved him, whose death was also tragic and pointless. We can feel the loss of this stranger through the story of the fictional character that preceded it, and Jeppes' story is only the beginning, because from now on, the difference between the fictional elements of the game and the reality of its creation begin to break down. Fictional stories are juxtaposed against their real counterparts. Frigg at one point even overhears the designers discussing the creation and intent of the Jeppe minigame. And this is the crux, because behind every fictional event throughout Welcome to Elk, there is its real counterpart. And this can't help but change how we begin to view and interpret the game. Story upon story, just like the man who died 3 times and the man who walked to Elk every day. To be honest, I was so surprised by this interjection of reality into my little fantasy world that I didn't really know how to take it. I didn't really like it at first. Except, after listening to the real story behind Jeppes' narrative and seeing how that death still affected this man years later, I understood what the game was trying to do. Fiction and reality are not always that far apart, and fiction is often a way for us to understand and reflect on our real experiences and emotions, a way for us to feel empathy for people we might never meet. And the game achieves this in a very exceptional and impactful way. It shows that games, like any other art form, aren't just escapism. They can be meaningful. They can change you. And what about Frigg? Jeppes' death and the discovery of his body have clearly shaken her to her core. And like the storyteller, it is an experience she will live with for the rest of her life. And I think it's fair to say that from this point in the game, death, connection, and the unknown become powerful ideas for Frigg. The experience has changed her. Death is something that we all have to face at some point in our lives, whether it's as a tangible experience like discovering or seeing a body, or just the long-term absence that is its intangible yet oh so physical aftermath. Anders, whom we met at the beginning of the game, is convinced that he and the other islanders are already dead, and you can understand why. Anders never knew his parents, so he has lived with that loss all his life. His belief that everyone is already dead, strangely, allows him to deny loss any further foothold in his life. After all, he can't lose anyone or mourn them in the same way if everyone is already dead. Anders as a character articulates a sort of strangeness about Elk and its position between reality and fiction, a strangeness that becomes more and more prominent as the game progresses. Are they all dead? Why is Anders in Frigg's dreams? Is Elk even a real place? The answer, of course, lies in the fact that with Welcome to Elk, we have something of a Schrodinger's cat situation. Elk and its inhabitants are both real and fake, the site of old stories and new ones. It is a place where fiction and reality intersect in a way that forces us to think differently about these stories, about how stories are often layered upon reality, and sometimes vice versa, and how they shape our understanding of both. If you've come this far, you may not mind me spoiling the end of the game, but if you do, please skip ahead to the times shown on the screen. Throughout the game, Frigg experiences strange dreams regarding Elk and its inhabitants, and in conjunction with her meetings with strange ghosts and Anders' insistence that they're in fact dead, Frigg begins to question the nature of Elk, of her sanity, of her existence. Is Anders right? Is Elk actually some sort of afterlife? And what about those eerie bottles that keep appearing on her desk? The ones that contain the stories she herself is experiencing as her lived reality. Just as Frigg feels ready to ask Anders for the truth, he disappears. And so, at the end of the game, Frigg goes through a mysterious door to find Anders and the truth about her reality. What comes next is video footage of Frigg walking around the triple-topping offices, and we're simply told by the game designers that there are no more stories. The end. I'm sorry. What? But I didn't get any final moment with Anders. I didn't get any answers as to the enigmatic nature of Elk as a place situated between reality, fiction, and dreams. As you can probably tell, I found this ending somewhat anticlimactic. But at the same time, I understand. These were the stories they wanted to tell, and Frigg was merely a vehicle for us to experience them as something real, something that we experienced ourselves. And when these stories ran out, well, there really was nothing more, because Elk only existed for those stories. And maybe the lack of catharsis is meaningful in its own right. We don't always get closure in life. Sometimes we just have to live with experiences and make sense of them ourselves, decide what they mean to us as individuals. Welcome to Elk pretty much leaves you to make up your own mind about what you experienced on Elk. Did it change you? Did it make you feel something? Will you remember it or talk about it with others? Will it make you think harder about the real people who lie behind the stories you hear? Will the stories live on in you now? I fully admit that Welcome to Elk isn't going to be everyone's cup of tea. You should go into the game expecting around 4 hours of gameplay, and my playtime included running around trying to find secrets and getting all 25 achievements, most of which the game gives you as part of regular gameplay. In terms of replayability, it's really what you'd expect from a narrative-driven game, and some may also find the limited gameplay frustrating. I know that I really wanted to be able to explore more, but that's just because I loved the world and the characters, and I just wanted more. When the credits rolled, I still wanted to hear more stories, play more minigames, and squeeze more llamas. And that's probably the highest praise I can give to a game, to leave me wanting more. What I want to emphasize more than anything is that the world building and characterization in Welcome to Elk is fantastic. The island has its own history and personality. You learn through your time there that Elk is a beautiful place, but it is also isolated and harsh. The islanders all have their own personalities and roles to play, and it is truly enjoyable getting to know them and talking to them. And the music in this game is phenomenal, because it manages to augment the game's mood at any given moment with changes in tempo and instrumentals, but it never feels disruptive or overly manipulative. So if you're in the market for something that's utterly unique and narrative driven, then I sincerely urge you to give Welcome to Elk a try. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Bad Ghosts, who encouraged me to write my review and also took the time to read my script and help with my audio. go check out his channel. He does fantastic reviews and he's also just a really lovely person. Thank you for watching the video.